The bar was dark, filled with nothing but smoke and the haze of lost dreams. Consumers of the establishment drank their weight in drink, forgetting the hopeless causes they would usually rally against. In the corner sat a man, a smallish man. If you saw him at a local golf club or a gentleman's gathering, he wouldn't be out of place. But here, in the dusty, dank refines of a local pub, he stood out like a sore thumb. His attire wasn't the same as the other customers around him. They all wore thick mining gear, heavily layered materials to prevent the cold seeping in. But the man in the corner didn't hold such worries. His attire was fancy, posh, bordering on royalty in these parts. He wore a thickly woven tweed jacket, a silky red waistcoat, a black tie, and a white shirt that was crisp and neat. His trousers were a checked blue and beige colour with an underlay of brown. On top of his head sat a very battered straw hat, the sides falling down with age. As the man sat there, thinking, a cup of some sort of brown liquid stood, getting warm. The man's face was down, so his features were covered in shadow, but the miners around him could see that they should steer clear. His attitude was one of wariness, a heavy hatred for something that would come, the next job, the next wife, something along the lines of a busy day with no real reward. Finally, leaning back, the man's aged face came into view. His mouth was lined, wrinkled, but not heavily. While his features looked old, his eyes looked even older, holding many secrets. His hair was greyed, but he definitely didn't look over the age of 50. Now that his face was no longer covered, the man began looking around for someone, but they hadn't arrived just yet. Clasping his hands together, the man looked into the crowd, filling out the pub. There weren't many aliens here, just a guild of miners huddled together for the small relief of company. The world the man had landed on was not one of a well-known disposition. It was a backwater planet, part of an empire who'd forgotten it, save for the days it arrived to retrieve the mined material. The man sniffed the air, the smoke holding a very passive smell to it, one that enticed calm, collected thoughts. The air was filled with a drug, but not one that would affect him or his to-be partner. Taking his straw hat off, the man placed it down on the table, brushing off the small flecks of dust that had landed since he had entered. Next to him on another chair sat a long umbrella, a handle shaped like a question mark. The question mark was coated in a flaking red paint. Under the red could be seen a gold colour. The umbrella itself was ancient, having spent many years travelling with the man. He looked down the shape of the mark and touched it fondly. As he did, a voice called out to him, a familiar one, but not one he'd heard for a while. "I see you still carry the umbrella then, Doctor." The man, the doctor, smiled and stood up, gesturing to an empty seat next to him. As his friend walked forward, the doctor spoke gently. "I hope your travels were safe, Doctor." The woman smiled at him, taking the empty seat that had been gestured to. The woman who had joined the doctor was Elizabeth Klein, an old travelling companion. Well, at first an old enemy, but then a travelling companion in his later life. She had a rather complicated history, but the doctor never really dealt with anyone that didn't. While she didn't look too old in person, around 45-50, she'd been around for much longer than that. She'd survived multiple timelines, all of which was thanks to the doctor. Motioning for the waiter, Klein ordered a gin and tonic before facing the doctor. He was sitting there, his legs crossed, his hands resting comfortably on his knee. He wore a faint smile, but his eyes gave away the wariness he was obviously carrying. "So, Doctor, this is rather unexpected, calling me all the way out here just for a drink. You know, Earth would have worked just as well." The doctor smiled, the same smile he usually made when he needed something, or someone. "Klein, I needed to speak to you in private, away from prying eyes. Even Earth would have been too, how shall I say, busy. But here," he motioned to the bar around them, "here, no one will take any notice of us." Klein sighed. There was never a straight answer with the doctor, always a puzzle, a game, a code that needed to be worked out. He wanted to talk in private, fine. He arranges for it to be brought here from the 90s, but who is he keeping away from? That he didn't seem to want to reveal, though he probably would, if given the correct little push. "Doctor, no more games. I'm getting rather bored of the whole mysterious stranger regime. I want something more compatible to a normal conversation." The doctor's grin fell slightly. He sat forward, his legs uncrossed and his arms resting on the table, his elbows making a dull dunk as he did so. "I'm in trouble, Klein. Serious trouble. More so than normal." Klein watched the doctor carefully, trying to see a smirk or a glint, something to assure her that this was just a game that he wanted to play. He always had a small glint in his eyes whenever he was planning something. Arrowsmith, her assistant, never saw it, his wonder and awe for the doctor blinding him to who the man really was. A meddler, a schemer, someone to be wary of. But Klein didn't see any sort of glint. There was no game, just a serious problem. Well, it had to be if he was coming to her, of all people. "All right, Doctor. What have you done?" "It's not what I've done, Klein. It's what I'm about to do. I've learned something rather dangerous. And now I need to change the outcome. I need to change events one last time." More schemes. More mystery. Klein sighed. Just then the waiter turned up, a drink in his hand. He placed it down, nodded to her, and then avoided eye contact with the doctor. Strange, but not uncommon. Strange, but not uncommon, Klein decided. She took a long drink from her glass and set it back down. The liquid was warm, slightly oily, but it tasted like alcohol, so Klein was fine with it. "Well then, Umbrella Man, what scheme are you playing this time? Whose life are you altering now?" "My own," the doctor said, his voice as serious as ever. Meddling in his own life affairs. Klein was puzzled. He'd never done this sort of thing before. Everyone else's lives, sure, but his own affairs seemed rather straightforward, off limits. Until now, obviously. Your own history? Your own timeline? Why? What have you learned? The doctor glanced around the pub, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of a listener or a watcher. Satisfied that no one was caring, he leaned forward and whispered in her ear, "I've learned about a timeless child." Straxus hated the Doctor. Not because of who he was. In fact, Straxus rather liked the Doctor's attitude towards life. It was his constant blundering that caused Straxus pain. Or rather, caused the Celestial Intervention Agency pain, which then, in turn, caused him pain. Standing in the Panopticon, Straxus was listening in to Versus's report to the President of Gallifrey. Temporary president, that was. The current president was away, so someone else had to fill in the role. As the report went on, it revealed several things about the dark times that everyone knew but still refused to admit to. As with most ancient races, a few black patches had to be made to create a better future. The CIA had uncovered a rather shocking secret, one that could potentially destroy all of Gallifrey. The Timeless Child, or rather an alternate set of events to what they were aware of. In Gallifreyan history, there were three high-remembered people, Razalon, Omega, and the Other. The three founding fathers. Two lost, one survived until impeached. Omega created time travel. The Other searched the stars, and Razalon... Well, Razalon created regeneration technically, but that didn't stop him claiming the rights to everything else. He changed and corrupted the DNA of thousands of species at the same time, but that was always brushed over. Now it turned out that regeneration came from another universe, from a genetic experiment on a child. That child in particular had turned out to be the Doctor. Straxus rubbed his eyes. It had only been a day since they'd found out about these changes, and already Gallifrey was breaking apart. Cardinals in uproar, the savages calling for the High Council's heads. At this moment, Romana and Leela were busy trying to calm down Gallifrey's allies, while the CIA were trying to find out how this had all come about. And now, on top of everything else, the Doctor was running off, threatening to reverse the damage, without even considering the impact. The timelines had been breached once before. Again would be disastrous without proper care. However, it involved the Doctor, so instead of trying to resolve history, Straxus now had to clean up the Doctor's mess, which could have caused the whole history to change in the first place. Straxus hated temporal mechanics. As the conversation drew to a close, Straxus excused himself and headed down the gleaming emerald corridors to the CIA headquarters. The Time Scoop was searching for the Doctor, his 7th incarnation to be exact. The one who had caused the most trouble. Fenric, Klein, Hex, Ace, everything he touched, everything he got involved in, always seemed to fall apart. Straxus entered the main chamber of the CIA and moved towards the central control unit. He waved the operator out and manipulated the viewer. It came up with an image of the timeless child. Splitting the screen, Straxus opened a file on the 7th Doctor and watched as a small tracker span away, trying to load a location. You won't find him. Straxus turned to see Marcel, the leader of the CIA time movements. He sighed. She wasn't his favourite person. Tall, slightly big in build, but an air of confidence that shone through. She had a charm like no other, and she always wore those ridiculously stupid glasses. Never mind, he thought. Won't I, Marcel? Well, I'd rather like to disagree to that. We found him before, and we shall do so again. Marcel chuckled, leaning against the back wall. Straxus rolled his eyes and turned to face her. He looked her up and down, her blue robe slightly too short for her, with an orange headdress covering her shoulders and curled locks. Rather formally dressed, aren't we? I have a meeting. About important things like the timeless child, the reinvention of our history, that sort of thing. Marcel was not a fan of Rassilon, or much of Gallifrey's history. To her, it was an example of poor taste. The Time Lords had to be the absolute best, and their past was as dark as it would come. She was part of a reform group who believed that maybe the timeless child was the true way of history, though she denies the idea of torture, putting it more to a nurturing state. Rather hypocritical, Straxus thought. We were not born from some sort of god, Marcel, most definitely not if that were the Doctor. That would be just enough to blow his ego overboard. Marcel grinned. Perhaps you should have asked the Master when he came back. Straxus grimaced. The Master had returned, that was certain. He'd been the one to bring forward the information, and he'd gone mad, nearly killing everyone. Luckily, the capital was more heavily defended than before, and his attempts were stopped. As Marcel exited the room, Straxus began to think. While he may not be able to find the 7th incarnation, maybe he could use another one of the Doctors to do his dirty work. Accessing the computers, he read the file of each incarnation, just to determine the right one he wanted. If the Doctor was messing up the timelines, he could bloody well fix it himself, even if it was a different incarnation to the one that was messing up the timelines. But he needed a Doctor that could hold his own against the 7th incarnation. And suddenly, a flash of grey hair appeared on the screen. Perfect. Klein couldn't help it. It was too funny. As she laughed, the Doctor's face had a bemused look about it. Trying to stifle down another giggle, she motioned to him to continue. I do understand the rather silly nature of my request, Klein, but I'm serious. I need your word. That's all. Just your word. The Doctor's face was a serious one. There was a hint of laughter behind it, but it wasn't breaking through. He knew the silliness of the question he'd asked, but Klein knew deep down that he would never have asked it unless it was important. He wasn't the sort of person who asked for help, or asked for what he'd just asked for. He was the kind of person that just went with the flow, having created a plan and then adapting that plan if the outcome needed it. And now he needed help with said plan. Alright, Doctor, but answer me this. Why now? Why not leave it to your next life, or the one that actually found out? The Doctor sighed, looking warily into the bar behind them. Suddenly his eyes aged in a matter of seconds, his body slumped, his face grew with wrinkles and wisdom. Klein gasped as she saw the Doctor morph from a young, normal version of himself to an older, much more wise and broken version. Less agile, but still definitely skilled. Because, Klein, I am coming to the end of this life. I have done many things I am not proud of, and will most likely bury half of them in my next incarnation. But for now, I must do what I am best at, and that is to meddle. Someone has messed up my personal history, rewritten Gallifrey, corrupted time. I see a future that will destroy us all due to these outcomes. And I honestly believe that if I don't do this now, a weary, tired old man who just wants to let go, then I never will. No incarnation will have the power to do what I do. They never have, and they never will. I have a special connection to my past, to the past of Gallifrey, and without it, I am not me. So it is only me, Klein, my life, my goal. Then I can rest, and who knows where I may end up next. Klein looked at the doctor, the sincerity in his eyes, the hope for a better future. She smiled at him, a tear in her eye. But it wasn't sadness nor happiness. She didn't know why it was there, but it was. Finally she spoke. Okay, Doctor. The word is giving. I give you my blessing. Change history. Rewrite Timeless Child. But Doctor, you don't need my permission. You need something else. Want something else. And I give that too. The Doctor stood up, smiling at her. He picked up his battered hat, flipped it onto his head. Picking up the umbrella, he clasped a hand on Klein's shoulder. She gripped it before he wandered out of the pub into the dark night raging around him. A few moments later, Klein heard the familiar whirl of the TARDIS as it bounced off into time and space. And sighing, Klein turned back to her drink. I forgive you, Umbrella Man. I will always forgive you.